Order, and welcome to today's session of the Transport Select Committee. Just before I invite our witnesses to introduce themselves, can I just remind witnesses and colleagues before we start that as a formal proceeding of the House of Commons, certain rules apply about referring to any specific court cases. So can I therefore ask you not to make reference to any live case that might be before the courts. That includes applications for judicial review. You can, of course, talk about the topics more generally, should you wish to, but please avoid referring to any live cases. For the purposes of our records, could I ask each of our witnesses to introduce themselves and their organisation, please? I'm going to start with you, Jacqueline.
Good morning, my name is Jacqueline Starr. I'm the Chief Executive of Rail Delivery Group.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Tobin. I'm the Director for Strategy, Policy and Reform at ORR.
Good morning, I am Alison Smith. I'm the Accessibility and Inclusion Lead at Network Rail and also extend that responsibility into GBR-TT.
Thank you and welcome all. Thank you for your time this morning. We've been doing quite a long-running inquiry into accessibility issues in transport. Later this morning we'll be hearing from the aviation and roads sectors, but for this first panel we want to concentrate on the rail sector. We've heard during the course of our evidence quite alarming stories about the difficulties people with disabilities or other mobility needs have while using the rail network, and that seems to be getting worse since the pandemic. Do you think that's a fair assessment of where we are? We'll dig into some of the specific issues in a minute, but I'm interested first of all in your overall impressions on this issue. Jacqueline, if I could perhaps start with you.
Thank you. Firstly, just to share, so the Rail Delivery Group, RDG, have a role in coordinating activity and delivery across the train operators, and in particular we have a key role to make sure that there is delivery against their accessible travel plans, ATPs. I certainly recognise that there are some inconsistencies across the network. I wouldn't support the statement that it is in absolute deterioration, because there is evidence, particularly around the passenger assist app that we offer, that there has been increased satisfaction from customers. But I do acknowledge that there are still way too many cases and instances where disabled customers experience difficulties when they're travelling with us, and we acknowledge that there are a number of failed assist as part of passenger assist. So we have measures in place to, of course, correct that, to include a working group that the Rail Delivery Group have instigated with the ORR and Network Rail to understand why these are happening, so that we can action plan to prevent them.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on that point in a minute, but first can I ask Stephanie and then Alison for your initial comments, please.
Thank you. Certainly I've listened to all the examples that you obviously have as well, and certainly they are very alarming. They do impact on the confidence of people to travel. They are very difficult to watch and understand what's actually going wrong. But on the whole, we carry out research on satisfaction of a wide variety of passengers. And on that basis, we can see that the majority of people do have a positive experience. That only works when every step of the process goes to plan. And I think what you're seeing is where one step, particularly we've discussed previously, ramps not being provided, where that doesn't happen, then effectively the whole system collapses for that passenger. So it's very difficult, but I do think on the whole, for the wide variety of passengers, when it goes well, it goes extremely well.
Okay. And Alison?
Yeah, so I would have, building on what colleagues have said, and from a Network Rail standpoint, we would be responsible and look after 20 of the largest stations in the country, so we do have a significant responsibility for supporting customers through those stations, and obviously we look after the infrastructure across the country. I would have characterised it as a huge amount has been done, and as colleagues have said, with the monitoring that we do and the insight we look at, in the vast majority of cases things do go right, but absolutely acknowledge there is lots more to be done, and some of the instances that we have similarly witnessed are unacceptable, we would agree. So more to be done.
Thank you. A lot of the evidence we've had points to the fact that while an individual journey may go well, and that possibly reflects the figures you referred to, Jacqueline, on the passenger assist, it's when there's a more complex journey, where there's a change of train, even a change of operator, or even a change to another mode of transport, that's when it often seems to fall down.
Yes.
Would you acknowledge that?
Yes, absolutely. We recognise that, and that's one of the reasons for instigating the group I referred to, whether it's the interventional systems or the human intervention as part of that process. Something is failing due to the complexity that more complex journey is introducing. So that's what we want to get to the bottom of, and really understand what those kind of trouble and pain points are, so that we can course correct that.
Is that good? The other witnesses concur?
If I can say, we think about it very much as a process, an interlinking process, and just for one step of that process to fail, for one member of staff, for example, not to adhere to the processes that are required, then it will fail. Yes, and so the more touch points you have in that journey, the higher the risk that something could go wrong.
Alison?
Yeah, I mean, we think of it as a chain of care, and we are one part of that chain, and it's important that we are very focused on our own performance, which of course we are, but we do collaborate extensively with colleagues in train companies and RDG to make sure those handover protocols are as strong as we can possibly make them.
Excuse me.
Would you also accept that a number of people with disabilities are just put off travelling altogether because of their fear that something will go wrong and the anxiety that induces? So whatever your satisfaction figures capture, there'll be another cohort of people who just have, for whatever reason, decided this is too much a problem for me, I can't face it. Do you accept that?
I accept that. I recognise that. At RDG, we have instigated a programme called Travelling in Your Shoes, which is where myself, the executive team, our senior leadership group are going out with disabled customers to truly understand those experiences. It's one thing to read it in black and white and analyse data, but it's another thing to experience that yourself. So that's why we've instigated that. And that has confirmed to us the challenges that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and why there is such reticence and lack of confidence in travelling with us, which of course we don't want people to experience. We want people to feel, regardless of disability, that they can use the railway as a preferred mode of travel.
If I could just briefly put it into context, the work that we do in assessing passenger satisfaction, where we did get a big sample, so we had over 8,000 passengers respond to us, which is significant. It is a small amount of people that we can look at, which is exactly your point, because we don't know the people that are not travelling. We can only look at the very small proportion, really, that are. So I think it's a valid point to raise.
Yeah, entirely valid point. One of the things, just in recognition of that we have added into, so we run a mystery shopping programme across our managed stations, and actually one of the things we do test as part of that is confidence level. Confidence before taking the journey based on everything that's being provided in terms of information, and then confidence once the journey's been taken. And interestingly, there is a part of it, there is a perception issue. So there is, we've seen some of those confidence stats actually improve once people have actually been able to experience the journey. But we do very actively look to listen to and understand people who are not using the railway and why, as well as and what those barriers are, and why people, and the reasons when people are using the service, what are the things which contribute most to that lack of confidence.
Thank you. Last question from me at the moment before I turn to colleagues. Is there an exemplar operator in this country or even overseas who have got it right or are close to getting it right that we can learn from?
I don't think there's a clear yes to that, because there are still failings across the network. So there are there are good and bad examples across all operators, and some operators are performing assistance exceptionally well, but conversely, those operators also have some failings. So I don't think there's a yes to that in terms of across the globe. I will acknowledge in preparation for this actually that we've identified that there is more opportunity for us to better liaise with colleagues from other transport sectors and across Europe and broader, not just from rail but perhaps air and other sources.
Stephanie, Alison, is there anyone you hold up as a good example?
I would agree with that. It's very difficult to highlight one particular operator or one area. It's all very different, and there isn't a single cause often of failure, so I'm reluctant to name anyone.
Alison?
We've looked both closer to home where there are some really good examples of best practice and learn where we can. How can we deploy those a bit more comprehensively? We're always very conscious when looking at international examples, or even some of the examples closer to home, the context within which some of those operations are potentially performing slightly better is a really important factor. So some things which work very well internationally may work less well in the UK because of some of the wider context. So I think it's always worth looking at benchmarking, but we've just got to be mindful of that context.
Just before I turn to Gavin, Carl, you wanted a quick supplementary?
Yeah, just on that question you just asked, Chairman. So have either the three of you watched the previous witness sessions for this inquiry? So you're aware that the good professor gave us some examples. You've been quite generic in what you've just answered. So are there any specific companies or specific countries where regulation has been or is about to be put in place that you think the UK could take lessons from? I'm going to ask the question again on behalf of the Chairman because I don't think you gave good enough answers.
As I sit here now, no, I can't offer a specific.
I understand you said you've done some research and you've looked at and you realise there's more to do, but what I'm saying is we've already got that answer and we're looking to you to give us some information that helps us recommend to the government what it should do. Now, Alison or Stephanie, you might have something to add to that. I'm going to give you a help. So we were told Canada or Norway. Any other examples, or do you think those are the two good countries that we should look at? But you're the people who are working in this sphere, so we're looking for you to give us some information that's helpful to us. I just don't think you were as helpful as you could have been.
I certainly haven't looked at legislation in other areas. It's obviously very familiar with the UK. I did listen to that session. I could understand what they were recommending, but certainly haven't assessed it.
Yeah, we have looked, when we've done our sort of international comparisons, we've tended to look more at sort of facility and service provision, less so regulation or legislation contributions to. Did hear the session and acknowledge Canada was mentioned, and Norway again. Some of the context within which Canada operates, it's a very different type of operation. So I think that context point is really useful.
May I just add a point to that, and perhaps this is still too generic, but we do work with a number of independent parties, so we work very closely with the Institute of Customer Service, who hold us to account also in terms of the level of service that we provide generally, but also for disabled customers. And we also use independents, and one very recently who is working with ourselves and GBRTT to develop the National Rail Accessibility Strategy. So that doesn't enable us to reference specific countries or examples, but we use them to bring a global perspective to some of the consultation process. So there is that feed.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Gavin, I'll turn to you next.
Thanks very much, Chair. In terms of booked assistance, Steffi didn't want to mention specific operators, but if you look at the latest report compiled by the ORR, apparently makes better reading than it did previously, but it's still lacking, I think it's fair to say. For instance, I'll name ScotRail, which here is the third highest, or third best in terms of providing all booked assistance types in this, but it's still only performing at 84%, so that's 16% of the time it's not, and that's the third best operator. The worst being 76%. I wouldn't name them, but clearly the delivery still needs to improve significantly. We've heard from Transport for All, who are critical of the ORR in terms of their enforcement. You say that your enforcement approach is to take early and informal regulatory action to try and stave off more formal action. So how effective, given the criticism that's been levelled at the ORR, how effective do you think that has been?
I think there's two things just to mention to put that into context. We have two routes of enforcement. One is through health and safety legislation, where we have inspectors on the network, and we may touch on that when we come to ramps. And the other is economic enforcement under our licences that we grant operators on Network Rail. I think Transport for All were referring to the more economic side, and what perhaps they don't see, and most people don't see, is the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes and the amount of things that we do change, where we intervene and change behaviour and we don't necessarily shout about it. Now, some of your previous witnesses are very well aware of that because they raise issues to us and they see us taking action and changing things. Enforcement is something that certainly is there as a tool, but we have to balance up proportionately. What's our priority? What's going to deliver the best outcome here? What are we doing in terms of funding for tax holders? And really thinking, is that move to formal enforcement really going to deliver the best outcome? So a lot is done, and I can certainly come back to the committee if it's helpful to explain various examples of that. But what you see above the surface is purely the action, the enforcement action.
Do you think the threat of more formal action from ORR would improve things quicker?
Well, we do it in two ways. We take proactive action where we decide on subjects that need deep dives. At the moment, we are looking at transfer of information between operators, what we call the handling protocol. We're looking at lift reliability and information for passengers, and we're looking at how easy it is for passengers to complain if they have a disability. So we're taking deep dive approaches, but then also reactive approaches, which is where some of your previous witnesses come in, and where things like social media are very helpful, because particular instances are brought to our attention which we can then follow up, which can lead to enforcement action, and indeed has led to action on ramps, for example, in relation to ScotRail.
To your point about not shouting about it, the action or the kind of informal work that you do, should you be shouting about it so that all of us are more informed, not just?
I think yes is the short answer to that, and I say that simply because I'm going to a meeting later today to talk about some of the work that we do that we don't promote and perhaps we should do more widely, and use it also as a potential communication tool to the operators where we have intervened, where they have similar issues. And sorry, one last thing just on you picking out the worst performers. We're also auditing the 5 lowest performing operators in our survey results to see why they are lower than some of the higher performing ones.
And just, I suppose for the record, can you tell us how many improvement notices you've issued related to accessibility?
We've actually only issued 1 improvement notice, and that was in relation to ramp provision. It was where the operator was using trains where an operator should have been able to provide a ramp, and this was a health and safety improvement notice, and instead in the way there was a bike storage area. Now, we engaged with them extensively to ask them to resolve that. You would assume that they would have operated quite quickly to fix that, but unfortunately that went on to such a period and we had such a disagreement that the only way to change their behaviour was to issue an improvement notice. But it is a last resort, I do accept that.
In terms of the regulations themselves, do you think, given that they're a bit disparate and there's obviously different regulations for light rail, heavy rail, etc., would it be easier for ORR to enforce regulations if it was one simple set of regulations that was essentially the same across the board and was clearer in the actions that advise you to take, i.e. must take action, etc., etc.?
I actually think it's not whether it's clearer for us, because I think we deal with the tools that we've got quite well. I think, is it better for the industry to understand what it is they need to do and not have sort of, if you consolidated things, for example, would that be simpler? Would it be more effective for people to understand their responsibilities? Because now they have to look across multiple pieces of legislation. So I look at it from that perspective. They may find it more helpful. But we do respond with the tools that we've got quite effectively, I think.
Okay, and Jacqueline, if I can come on to you. That last question to Stephanie relates to a point the RDG has made in terms of the regulatory framework being complicated, I suppose, to say the least, but that's the nature of the UK's fragmented rail system, and operators obviously have different expectations. So what is the RDG doing itself to try and rectify this situation? Have you had conversations with, say, the ORR, Network Rail and indeed the DFT on all of this, and can you feed that back to us?
Well, we work hard to try to navigate all of the regulation and legislation that's there. I definitely support Stephanie's last point around consolidation would be, from a train operator perspective, exceptionally helpful, and we've shared that view and had those conversations. There's need for a tighter action plan to address that if we believe that that's the right thing to do, noting some of the kind of complexities of changing regulation and removing elements of it to compound that, but to have a single reference point for train operators and then to be held account by the regulator for those in a timely fashion would be extremely helpful, and I believe would also give us some pace around some of the changes that we see as an industry. When we have serious incidents across the network, we are very collaborative. We all engage immediately on those. What we perhaps don't see is then the remedial action that needs to take place as a follow-on, and so I think that would be extremely helpful.
Alison, what conversations have Network Rail, or did the GBR transition team been having with regard to any potential consolidation of regulations?
I mean,
would you welcome that?
Well, simplification in any context is helpful, and the rail industry certainly has opportunities to do things more simply. And I think the plan for rail and the reform agenda set out a very clear call to action in that regard. We, as I say, would welcome all opportunity to simplify things and to bring that consistency. I do think the work the ORR did and consulted extensively on insofar as the ATP guidance, or the Accessible Travel Policy guidance, which applies consistently as a sort of floor, if you like. We as Network Rail, we have one single national accessible travel policy that applies to all of our managed stations. We get the opportunity every year to reflect on our performance in relation to that and offer up improvements. We talk very regularly to the ORR about what we're doing. We see that, as I say, as an absolute floor, not a ceiling. The other areas that we look after more so in our sort of capacity as infrastructure provider, we have the Code of Practice, which is a part of the Railways Act, and DFT is actually consulting on that just now, so we will take the opportunity to offer some suggestions as part of that consultation on how to simplify the code. But we're committed to the idea it's important to kind of retain that as a part of primary legislation. And then under the Equalities Act, how we simplify it for our colleagues is, though, as well, notwithstanding the complexity of the regulation, and we have mechanisms internally to simplify that for our colleagues.
Okay, and lastly from me, Chair, we've reached consensus on simplification of regulations, but can I ask each of you, beyond simplification, what would be the one thing that if you would change about the regulations that we currently have? And I'll start with Alison. Sorry. I can see your faces of it.
What would be the one thing? So again, we've done a lot of work to make sure some of the complexity that sits at the regulation level we've translated for our colleagues into much clearer, more straightforward guidance. Some things which sit in legislation, so I do refer to the Code of Practice, because they are part of legislation, they can be difficult to change, and it can take time to change. So one thing we'd probably look for is the ability to slightly streamline what's in that code so it can be flexed to accommodate changing standards around building regulation, etc., etc. That's probably the one thing that would make our life slightly more simple.
If you've made it more difficult for the other panellists to answer, but I'll just go down to Stephanie.
I don't know if I'd point at one particular thing, but if there was an exercise to bring things together, potentially to simplify or consolidate, it certainly would provide the opportunity to consider whether there are any overlaps or gaps. some of the information, some of the regulation it dates back to the late 90s, and I feel this is an area that moves particularly quickly.
It's a rolling stock.
Yes. So it does move particularly quickly, and operators have to adapt. And where there's no guidance on that, that is now evolving. I'm thinking of things like, for example, mobility scooters, where we may consider to do more in the future. But I do feel there's an opportunity just to consolidate and move forward.
Exactly.
And I would just build on that. So Rail Delivery Group and GBRTT are working collaboratively on a national rail accessibility strategy. So that is the kind of here and now strategy to deliver ultimately against disabled customers' needs. It should be real time, and it should move, and it should reflect needs on an ongoing basis, and regulation needs to cope with that, as opposed to looking at what might have been relevant yesterday or years ago. So for me, one of the key changes would be for regulation to be able to cope with real-time changes in a strategy which is wholly based on the needs of disabled customers, because it's then that we'll ultimately consult and deliver against the requirements within that.
Okay, thanks.
Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Stephanie, you've kind of touched on this already, but what is the ORR doing to firstly monitor and then the use of non-compliant equipment across the network? So, for example,
I missed that slightly. To monitor
and enforce the use of non-compliant equipment, so for example wheelchair ramps.
Okay, so the example I was thinking of on ramps was fairly recently, it was brought to our attention that one operator was not storing or maintaining ramps appropriately. So we engaged with that operator to understand whether they had a maintenance schedule, how they were storing the ramps, what their plans were to improve things. As a result, they actually withdrew a lot of the ramps from their station and decided to use ramps on the train instead. That has now evolved into actually deciding perhaps the train ramps wasn't the best option, and they're moving back to replacing effectively ramps on the platform. So that was done without an improvement notice, but it was done through actually looking at different stations, looking at maintenance schedules, looking at working patterns, trying to understand what staff were doing on the ground, but then looking across the wider network for that particular operator. So I still think there's more to do, but that was with our health and safety inspectors who are actually on the network and can actually visibly observe what's going on.
So how often do these health and safety inspectors go out onto the network to check that?
We have over 100 inspectors now. They're on the network every single day. I wouldn't say they're on, obviously there's 2,500 stations, so they have to prioritise their work appropriately. But it is a matter of when an issue is brought to our attention, even if it is reactive. I mean, obviously we have a proactive programme of work, which might be, for example, looking at level crossings. But if an issue is brought to our attention and we recognise it's not an isolated incident, it wasn't a single person who perhaps didn't adhere to a process, it's actually more a maintenance issue, perhaps a hazard for passengers and staff, then they will start to look at that more widely and start to sample stations. So, I mean, it is an important message for us that we can choose proactively what to look at, but the information we receive from passengers and from stakeholders then directs us to look at things more reactively as well.
So are you able to confirm that all wheelchair ramps across the network currently in use are compliant with the regulations?
I wouldn't be able to give a cast iron guarantee to that, so it's a question of whether we were going to carry out that work with every single operator now. And when you're looking at one operator who's had a problem, you're then questioning, well, is this a wider problem? So that is still an option for us, and we're certainly discussing that in coming weeks about what more we need to do, because the issue of ramps does seem to be becoming more high profile. There seems to be more things coming into the media where we have concerns, and it's just whether it is now we need to take it more widely. But you would also hope that the profile of what we have done would act as a deterrent for other operators, but I can't give a black or white answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. Alison, could I just ask a question to you? Why is it that Network Rail are still building new inaccessible infrastructure, so for example footbridges?
So I will sort of offer you some context from both on the one hand station context and then off station. So for example where we might be looking to close level crossings. So in the station, beyond just our general obligations to ensure we've paid due regard to all protected characteristics at the point we're changing anything about our infrastructure. We have the code of practice. It would be in very rare situations we'd ever install, as we took the opportunity to put new infrastructure in, we would ever install inaccessible infrastructure in our station environment. We do have formal dispensation routes that we would have to pursue if we had to do that, and that gives, a lot of scrutiny is placed on that to make sure that's an entirely appropriate decision. So in a station context it would be absolutely by exception, and we would only do that with scrutiny from DFT colleagues in the ORR, etc. Outside of the station environment, which is probably where the vast majority of our potential need for footbridges exists, because we've got thousands of crossing points on the railway, and we have to, under our obligations under the Equalities Act, we have to think very carefully and balance what can be quite often a set of competing needs. So we look at health and safety. Many of these crossings are being closed because they carry such a high risk of death. And then at that point we go in and look at and explore every possible option for putting an accessible footbridge in, but we have to balance that with some of the sort of wider considerations. So line-side neighbours, very often these are in locations we can't power with a lift, so we're talking about ramps. Ramps can be very substantial bits of infrastructure, not always supported by the community. So again, it's a case of we have to balance up what can at times be competing needs and make sure we make a decision that's in the best interests of the taxpayer. It's never our intention to go in with any preconceived idea that the footbridge would be stepped. That would be a decision we have to make in the round.
And could you provide us with an update on when the results of the network-wide accessibility audit for stations will be published?
So DFT concluded those audits April. They did some final work on the data set in about May. We did take possession of the data from a Network Rail standpoint just at the end of October. And we're now working towards sort of fully integrating that into our asset management systems, and we are working collaboratively with colleagues in RDG to start to establish the integration timeline for that data set into some of their systems, which are passenger facing systems, and we are working to provide that data set back out to train companies and the teams in Network Rail to use that to help start to inform investment priorities. It's a complex data set, it's a very large data set. It's not in its current state possible to provide that directly to customers. It needs quite a lot of transformation to ensure it's valuable to customers, which it will be. It's a game-changing data set, but so what we've been doing is we've worked directly with disabled people to give us to sort of form the basis of their requirements and work that back into the data set. So we're very clear what we need to do, and we're now in the process of delivering on that. So
you have a time scale on it?
So we are, we're still finalising some of the details of that, but we are, in stages going to be in a position to release that data. So we have, early next year, well, we're already able to provide that data to train companies. We're giving them access. Now we've transitioned that across into Network Rail. We've got the first thing we'll do is build what we call an API, which will give that data. That will go into Rail Data Marketplace, which makes it available for developers, and then we will have that integrated into RDG's station information pages. All of that will take place over the next 6 to 9 months, and then slightly longer term we are looking at something called an accessible journey planner. That doesn't just rely on the station data, that needs to integrate with train data and with staffing data. So that's a slightly longer term commitment.
Okay, thank you. And a question for all of the panel really, what are the biggest barriers to accessibility? Where does it lie Is it infrastructure? Is it funding, culture? What is it that you believe? I'll come to you, Jacqueline, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, disabled customers would respond to that by saying that the reason that they are always given is funding. I think that that is true in part, but I don't think it's the whole reason. I think there's a question of prioritisation, and that should be assessed, and we also welcome the ORR's kind of role in making sure that we get that right as an industry. So funding is definitely part of it. There are some challenges in terms of human intervention, so we need to make sure that we've got the proper skill set, and we're doing quite a lot of things across the industry to make sure that people are sufficiently trained to be able to deal with disabled customers in the way we'd expected. So those are probably the two key ones I would offer.
Very similar. I think it is a combination of the people, the skill set, the knowledge, and adherence to the actual processes, because I do think there are processes there for the majority of instances where you require assistance, but the important one that's going to make it all pull together will be technology, which requires the investment. So we do see it as a combination of factors, not just one simple thing, unfortunately.
Sorry, same answer, Steph. And we've done a lot of work on this as part of, our thinking on the National Rail Accessibility Strategy. We've got there's a range of factors which in combination do contribute. There's some aspects of that are very directly related to the provision and the service for customers, and there are also barriers, which make it more difficult for our staff. So better data, better tools, better equipment, etc. So we're focused on those, but there's no one single silver bullet.
Thank you, Jack.
Just before I turn to Graham, Jack, you wanted a quick supplementary?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And the main thing I wanted to ask you about is lifts, but if I may, I just wanted to ask you a bit more, Alison, about the ramp issue, because you said, as you rightly say, ramps take up a lot of space, can often be difficult to install, but the guidelines around ramps, the gradient of those is extremely shallow, isn't it, at the moment within your guidelines? So do you think that is too restrictive, and should that be looked at further?
They're not our guidelines, they are wider guidelines, right. Which we obviously and appropriately, so that is a standard that sits, that's not a railway specific standard. We would be guided therefore by, the body that looks after determining that, and, certainly it's not just about the sort of steepness that wheelchairs, there's also some stamina. If it's so stamina issues factor into that, and but it's not a railway standard. It's
a wider standard.
A wider standard.
The main thing I wanted to ask about lifts was around the fact that we've had lots of issues with lifts not working throughout the network, and that was raised by a number of our witnesses previously. And a lot of the lift infrastructure on the network is an ageing infrastructure. A lot of it is, not the same. We've got all different types of lifts throughout the network. Do you think there should be more of a rolling programme of lift replacement through Network Rail to actually better standardise the lift infrastructure and ensure that we can have a more effective and more reliable lifts throughout our stations?
We have identified lifts as a priority within our CP7 plan, so there is money in CP7 to address that exact issue.
Is there anything I wanted to add on that?
No, I'm not an expert in it, but I do know there is money available. We have seen Network Rail put forward plans around this, so I think it's a very high agenda item.
Thank you, Chair.
Graham, we'll turn to you next.
Thanks, Chair. Stephanie, I think earlier on you mentioned the pre-booked passenger assist arrangements. What's your assessment as to how that's working? And would a passenger need to pre-book that 24 hours in advance or an hour in advance in order to get the assistance? Or is it with ramps and someone to assist on and off the trains and so on? Or is it variable according to the operator? Is it fair to ask you that? Or?
You can ask me. It's certainly not variable, and 24 hours was applicable up until 2019. So
I'm sure we heard a figure of 2 hours.
yes, so now it's at 2 hours. We instigated policy that reduced it from 24 to 10 p.m. the night before to 6 hours to 2 hours. We did that over a 3-year period because we felt we needed to give the industry time to adapt. So the period now is up to 2 hours before travel. You should be able to pre-book assistance, although I am aware that one operator just allows people to turn up and go without any pre-booking at all. Every operator can offer turn up and go, but obviously for the industry, and Alison and Jack are better to talk about this, but it's easier to resource and plan if people are giving advanced notice of assistance. But at the same time, you can turn up at any station and watch people turn up and go every single day.
I wonder, perhaps you could amplify that, Alison, in relation to other operators and the aspiration of getting to turn up and go for disabled people wishing to travel by rail.
Yes, so in Network Rail, I think the mix that we now support is about 60% of the assistance that we... Sorry?
I didn't quite...
Oh, sorry, I'll speak up. In a Network Rail context, we deliver about 40% of the assistance that's delivered across the network. That's just through 11 stations. I think we're about 60% is booked and about 40% is unbooked, so turn up and go. And we recognise that's a really important part of the proposition. We are well equipped to deliver that. We don't see any particular variation between our performance. I have a definite perspective from Network Rail, but not maybe more widely.
Okay.
I guess I would start by saying that we do recognise that a large number of disabled customers are calling for a turn up and go railway, and we shouldn't be immune to that.
We're quite specific, weren't we?
And I, from a moral perspective, then of course, why wouldn't disabled customers want the same service that we all enjoy as able-bodied customers? I would be nervous around our ability to deploy that, given some of the challenges that we currently have with scheduled assistance. And so the working group that we've set up to get to the pain points and the process fractures that Stephanie referred to is really critical to demonstrating our ability to then deliver against that.
I did notice on the ORR Twitter feed, or whatever it's called now, publicising the new railway station at Gatwick, £250 million. I'm assuming that will be completely compliant with lifts and ramps to ensure that disabled people have access to the airport and on and off the trains. Is that correct?
So one of our roles, as you point to, is the authorisation of new stations. Yeah. So I'm certainly familiar with that one, and there have been some issues around that we have intervened to look at the project, to look at the work, to ensure that things are compliant with the regulations. So yes, we are quite close to that one.
I hope the new stations at Hartlepool and Sunderland, or the reconstructed stations, are going to have their disabled access, not least for me. Okay, can I ask you about, again, some evidence we heard from the first panel, and you mentioned the aspiration of operators to move towards turn and go, but their view was one of the reasons why that isn't happening is disabled access is seen as a kind of a customer services issue rather than a fundamental issue of human rights. Is that a reasonable contention? Is that how the operators look at it?
I don't think it's a unanimous yes to that. I mean, there is a huge appetite across operators to deliver against the needs of disabled customers, and they hear loud and clear what they're calling for in relation to turn up and go. Are there some challenges in terms of people really recognising that and showing appropriate empathy? Yes. Are we doing something about that? Yes. So we're undergoing significant training to help people better understand. So it's not a unanimous yes to that, but we do recognise that there are challenges in that space to overcome.
In terms of carrots and sticks, who imposes the fines? Is it Network Rail or the ORR for non-compliance on operators?
If it's non-compliance with the accessible travel policy, ultimately that would be the ORR.
And are the fines effective, or do operators just think, well, it's an inconvenience, and rather than go at the expense and the trouble of reorganising timetables and staff rosters, we'll just pay the fine?
So there isn't a failure fine arrangement. It's not, there isn't a standard, like, for example, delay repay, claim compensation. And I do think, some people might find that sort of target fining approach appropriate in other industries. Certainly it's not something that we have imposed, and it's more about identifying the wider, broader issues that are causing the failures across the network and trying to intervene to stop those at the fundamental level. So we're not imposing fines at that level.
Did you tell my colleague earlier that there was only one improvement notice?
That was a health and safety improvement notice. And we have imposed, if I give you an example, we imposed one fine for one operator several years ago for £5 million, and that was not for accessibility, but that is a very difficult position to reach, and that affected hundreds of thousands of passengers over a period of almost 2 months. So it's not something we would go into lightly, and certainly in the environment that rail is in now, you have to look at the trade-offs there of what impact that would have on the funds of the Secretary of State.
What would be the scale of fines on operators? You mentioned that real punitive fine, but is it a frequent occurrence where fines are applied to operators?
No, it's not.
Could you give us a number?
On the number of fines or the level of fines?
Well, both actually.
We could fine up to 10% of turnover. The number of fines I don't have a number for you. I mean, I could get that for you. I would say it's relatively low.
May I also add that there are potentially more serious ramifications of failure to adhere to ATPs, in that it's a breach of licence agreement, which of course would have more serious implications for a train operator.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Graham. And for our final question for this panel, Greg.
Thank you, Chairman. Stephanie, this is more for you. You spoke earlier in answer to earlier questions about proactivity of monitoring potential issues before they arise, but we've heard evidence in previous sessions from users, customers and campaigners in this space that there's a perception that when the ORR becomes aware of an issue, very good at then taking that on, putting in place compliance action, but people don't really believe there's anything actually out there trying to pick up issues before customers come face to face with them. Is that a fair complaint? And how do you, what would you say to the gap between what you said earlier about your proactivity and the actual experience on the ground of real people who are coming across issues every day?
So our understanding and experience of real life issues comes from a variety of sources. So one, it's from my own team and from ORR colleagues being on the network, and that includes our health and safety colleagues. It's from the large proportion of data that we collect. I said that we had surveyed 8,000 passengers just on accessibility, and it's on the interrogation of that data. And then it is regular engagement with all of the operators, with Network Rail, with our accessible travel advisory panel, and effectively it's a combination of factors. Now, yes, I understand that people raise issues with us. Often they're very perceptive, very knowledgeable people who understand the issues to point at, and most often we will follow those up, but quite often they are not aware, as you've just said, of what's going on then behind the scenes, what we're doing, deep dives, audits, engagement with individual operators where their performance is not as high as others, trying to understand why that is, and then trying to drive improvement. But everything is about trying to raise the overall standard of improvement, and we will always balance our resources on proactive work and reactive response work.
If I come back on that really briefly, if the perception is bad, the customer experience will be bad. So how can you, if all of that proactivity is in place, and I take your word for it, unless you fix the perception gap in that, there is still going to be a bad customer experience at best and total distrust at worst from people with disabilities or other needs looking at the railways.
I think that there's a difference between the perception of what ORR is doing. I wouldn't say we have a huge public profile. In fact, I don't think we look for that. With passengers, that would be for Transport Focus. But the perception of passengers is affected by so many other factors that may give them a lack of confidence and willingness to travel. Indeed, you have to look at it as a double-edged sword. It's helpful for people to raise particular issues where they've come across failures. Equally, if those issues then impact other passengers who don't want to travel. So there is a need for confidence building. I don't think it sits with ORR to do that, and I don't think we create a lack of confidence in the things, in passengers taking decisions, because we simply don't have that profile. But I think there is something about the industry giving confidence to passengers, pointing out all the good work that does go on, explaining how people can request assistance, and explaining to them what they can do if things go wrong, because invariably you need to balance it up. But I wouldn't say the perception all sits with ORR.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid the clock is against us. We have two further panels to hear from this morning. But for now, can I thank all three of you very much indeed for your time and evidence this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And could I invite the second panel, please. Welcome to our second panel as we consider aviation for our inquiry. For the purposes of our records, could I ask each of you to state your name and organisation, please, starting on my left. Karen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Dee. I'm the Chief Executive of the Airport Operators Association. We are the trade association for UK airports.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Griggs. I'm the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Airlines UK, and we're the trade association for UK registered airlines.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Bowles, and I'm the Head of Consumer Policy and Enforcement at the Civil Aviation Authority.
Thank you all for your time this morning. If I could start by asking Rob and Karen. According to recent CAA figures, around 60% of people with a disability have experienced difficulties in accessing airports and planes. Could you just talk me through, firstly, who's responsible at what point in a passenger's journey through the airport and onto the craft? Who'd like to start?
Shall I kick off?
Thank you.
As the airport, we are responsible for that journey once the passenger arrives at the airport. So quite often that's provided through third-party services that contract with the airport, and it is that service, our responsibility to ensure that service through security to the gate, and then up until the point, and including boarding the aircraft, at which point we hand over to the airline.
Yes, and conversely, when passengers leave the aircraft as well, that will be the airport's responsibility. Airlines play a really important role, particularly with pre-notification. So an absolutely key part of the whole system to work properly is ensuring that the airlines are communicating the special assistance needs to the airports in a timely way. So airlines will make sure through our processes that we are getting that assistance information at the time of booking or thereafter, and then that will be transmitted through to the airports, usually around 36 hours before travel.
Could I just add one further point, which I didn't mention? In terms of then loading equipment, of course, that is the responsibility of the ground handlers who contract typically with airlines. So, if there's wheelchair equipment, that would need to be provided. That service is provided by the ground handlers, outbound and inbound.
Just to clarify, if someone has a wheelchair or other bit of equipment, at what point do you, as at the airports, do you have any responsibility for that, or is that entirely the indirectly to the airlines?
I think it depends on at what point the person is being required to use, if we will provide alternative wheelchairs or mobility assistance. So at the point at which the passenger is transferred to alternative arrangements, those then would be go to the ground handlers. Sometimes that's as late as actually boarding, so some equipment can be taken up with the passengers. They can use their own up until the point of getting onto the plane. It depends on the type of equipment.
And just to add quickly, it's obviously really important that the airline's role is to make sure that any mobility equipment or wheelchairs are transported safely, obviously within the aircraft or on board, and getting to the destination appropriately. So that part of obviously the in-flight process and making sure that's done properly would be our responsibility too.
Given that 3 in 5 approximately experience problems, where are the weak points in the system you've just described? Why does it go wrong for so many people?
Aviation is complex. There's lots of places, depending on the individual person's needs, where things can go wrong. Sometimes that's, there is a problem with pre-notification that I think we all recognise. And the more information we have about individuals' needs beforehand, the better we're able to plan for that. But things do go wrong. Sometimes that's within the staff that are within the services. So there's a training requirement that is being addressed. Sometimes it's that we don't have all the information that we need, so the equipment turns out not to be quite what we were expecting, or that there were, the passenger isn't aware of some of the restrictions that might apply. So, there are certain things that are not easily carried aboard aircraft, batteries, etc. Cause some have to be treated in a special way for safety purposes. So there are lots of areas which we want to address, and part of that is making sure that passengers are given as much information as possible about what they need to tell us, and therefore what we then can deliver for them. So I think information in advance is really crucial, and something that I think the industry recognises there's more for us to do, but there are various touch points where things can go wrong in a complex environment, and we're working hard to make sure that we reduce those.
Okay, Rob, from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Karen. I think that number of those experiencing difficulty is obviously too high. I think what is good is that looking at that same sort of survey data, it suggested that those who have travelled more recently are having a better experience, which isn't to say a perfect experience or that there isn't a lot more to do, but it feels that there is a generally improving picture. There's greater awareness of the needs, and systems are being put in place. So there's definitely more to do, and that number is too high, but there is I think there is safe to say there's progress. It's certainly something that airlines take incredibly seriously. There's a huge amount of work going on, and as Karen said, pre-notification is hugely important, because where you can have issues is where, for example, if you had an airline coming in from overseas where those rates were lower, you may then have sort of a spike in demand within the airport, which can have knock-on effects with the ability for the airport service providers to meet the needs of other aircraft coming in. And always within aviation, which is a complex ecosystem, if you have weather delays or other things, that can compound that. So we say that not by way of excuse, it's more to flag it is complicated, but of course, we need to make sure as a sector that we are putting in place sufficient resilience to meet those kinds of situations when they occur. And the final point I would make is there is generally a huge amount of increasing demand. So there was something like 3.5 million pre-notifications for assistance over the last sort of reported year period. My understanding is that doesn't include those who arrive at the airport not having pre-notified, which can still be a considerable number. And of course, there's lots of reasons why someone may not pre-notify. You may be booking at the last minute. You may not realise on arrival at an airport that you need the assistance that you thought you might not. So there are lots of reasons for that. But we are expecting, particularly next summer, with passenger numbers coming back up to where they were pre-pandemic and even beyond, there's probably going to be a greater percentage of people seeking assistance than there have been historically. So it's going to be really important that not just airlines but the whole system recognises that long in advance, make sure that the resources are there.
Now, as you said, things travelling by air can be a complex process. There are all sorts of issues that can occur and disruption happens. It can be stressful for even seasoned travellers, but someone with a disability can end up feeling very distressed if they are not being handled properly. And they will not really want to care whether it's the airline or the airport. Is there more to be done in having a sort of single point of reference at airports who can assist people with disabilities when there is disruption? Is that something you're looking at?
I think that better coordination is always something that the sector wants to deliver. I think at each sort of airport they will take a role and have a forum with their airlines that they're operating with. And I think that's, you're absolutely right that the passenger doesn't care who is responsible for that part of the journey. What they want is for it all to work. And I think that we recognise that there are forums that meet regularly at each of the airports. Some of those are slightly different. A lot of the time they will, and those are there for looking at incidents as well. So they will, any complaints, but also where we see that things are going wrong, you can use CCTV, and those forums then will allow for that to be investigated. But I think certainly the airport PRM system, the service there, should be taking a lead to ensure that it's coordinating and trying to help where it can.
Rob?
And I'd say that I think it's absolutely recognised that if you're travelling, as you say, you don't care which part of the system is responsible for what, and you will have primarily a relationship with the airline. That's with whom you've bought your ticket. So I know the airlines will work closely with the airport and airport colleagues in terms of handling issues or complaints if they come through. One example I think of recent good practice is that we, as airlines with airports and others, we work with DFT to publish it's now called the Air Passenger Travel Guide. It was the Air Passenger Charter. And I think that quite neatly sums up what expectations are throughout the journey for all passengers, but also disabled passengers and those with additional needs, what you should do, who you can talk to, and how you can complain if you need to. So that's by no means a silver bullet, but there have been steps taken to try and make sure the information is out there for those who need it.
Just before I hand over to colleagues, Anna, can ask you to reflect on what you've just heard. It was the CAA figures who said that nearly 60% of people have difficulties. Are things getting better or worse or not much change?
I think maybe it's helpful if I set out our role and how we enforce the legislation. So the CAA is the body responsible for the enforcement of passenger rights legislation in the UK. We do this under the banner of our access to air work, and a key part of that is a framework that we refer to as the airport framework, which we introduced in 2014. And what that does is it sets out a set of standardised requirements at airports in order to allow us to compare how different airports are performing in the provision of accessibility services. And primarily that focuses on the timeliness of the provision of service, but it also looks at the quality of service, and we get that information from surveys of the individuals who are receiving the assistance. And we published the first annual report relating to that. So we gather the information on a monthly or a quarterly basis, but every year we publish an annual report, and that scores the airports and sets out how they each perform. So they could be very good, needs improvement, or poor. And what we've seen over time is that no airport likes to be bottom of the pile, no airport wants to be considered poor. And so in the years that we've been undertaking that work, that the airports have improved, and have significantly invested in the services that people are receiving. We believe that everybody should have access to travel by air, be that whatever their disability, whether that's visible or non-visible. And actually some of the investment that we see at airports is also about non-visible disabilities, so making sure that everybody has that confidence to travel. Because of the success of that framework, we are proposing to introduce a similar framework for airlines, and we've consulted on that relatively recently. So the consultation closed in June, and we hope that will drive similar sorts of improvements. I think I would absolutely agree, passengers don't care who is responsible for the provision of their service. They just want to get from A to B like everyone else and have a stress-free journey. I think it is improving. It's clearly still challenging, and there is more that needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. Jack, if I could turn to you.
Thank you, Chair. When it comes to things like safety, obviously the airline industry has a very good record, but as we've heard about accessibility issues, it's the reverse. So do you think that this should be treated more as a health and safety issue, and would that result in more focus and attention on improving things like disability access?
I don't think that it's seen as the reverse. I think that there are lots of very high-profile cases of things that have gone wrong that clearly shouldn't have gone wrong. Of the 3.4 million passengers who requested assistance last year, 88% of those were people who requested assistance for travelling through the airport, so people who can't walk long distances and can't walk up and down stairs. And so on the whole, their request for assistance kind of stops once they get on the plane, and they're okay to deal with the needs on the plane themselves. 6% of people are wheelchair users, and 6% of people are either blind, deaf, or have some other non-visible disability. And those more complex needs tend to be where things become more of a challenge, particularly as you get on the aircraft. There can be more inconsistency in the service that's provided, and I think that's where the focus needs to be on improvements.
And is there enough prioritisation being given to these issues by airlines and airports?
I think it's taken seriously by both airlines and airports. Like I've said, no airport wants to be rated as the worst airport, so no airport wants to be rated as poor. It's quite high profile when our annual report comes out. So they do take it seriously, but that's one of the reasons that we're looking to put in place a similar sort of framework for airlines, where we can identify how airlines are performing against quite a complex journey, and the consistency in the provision of meeting the obligations across all the different elements where airlines are required to provide support.
Rob and Karen, there's been obviously significant disruption was caused as a result of the pandemic, and obviously a lot of those staff were made redundant, which meant that when numbers came back, when people returned to flying, there wasn't necessarily the support that there had been. Are we now back to a state whereby that passenger assistance support is back to the standards that it was before the pandemic? Maybe Karen, if you want to.
Yeah, shall I take that? You're absolutely right. In 2022 was a very particular problem, and resilience across the airports, not just for disabled passengers but for all passengers, was very challenging. I think confidence is much improved. I think we have seen services much improved during 2023. Partly that's very significant investments, recruitment. Heathrow, for example, their service provider, I think, has added another 600 people since last summer to the service. And for 2024, the airports are continuing to invest in that, not just staff but also equipment, because we have also found, I think Rob touched on, most airports are seeing something like 20 to 30% increase in passengers requiring needs based on 2019, even though our overall passenger levels are still below pre-pandemic. So That's a good news story because it means that more passengers are travelling, but that has meant that airports have had to make those investments, which I think that we're pretty confident now that we're in a much better place. 2023 was much better than 2022.
So are those resources at the level that they need to be, do you think, or is there still further to go to get them to where they should be?
I think there's, airports will keep those levels under review, partly driven by the CAA annual reporting. And I would just say that, from an airport perspective, that is a good example of how the sort of regulatory reporting system drives the behaviours that we want to see, which is we are seeing those investments. It is taken very seriously and it's under constant review. So I think most of the airports believe they're in a good place. You're always trying to anticipate where demand will go. So Luton, for example, has retendered its service for its PRM service at least twice since the pandemic because it is seeing those increased levels. So airports are reacting where they can see that demand is there. Training was also an issue, but again, once the recruitment was in place, staff have been trained and are catching up. So that's, I think, driving a good feeling of confidence for going forward. But as I say, it's always kept under review so that we can continue to make those improvements that we see.
Or is there anything that you wanted to add on that in terms of how things recovered, and are airlines satisfied with how things have recovered in that respect?
Yes, so I think I won't cover again too much what Karen said. I think so. Yes, last year, the spring of last year and early summer was really challenging, not just for accessibility provision, but for the whole system. Hopefully, that was a one-off for very specific circumstances. This year has clearly been, notwithstanding issues that have not been sort of within the airport airline purview. It's been a good summer. We've had a strong summer, and in many cases, whilst overall levels of demand might be sort of equivalent or around 2019, often the spikes have been greater at certain times. The system's held up pretty well overall. As I said, I think just because I think there is confidence that there is the staffing there across the sector, including within airports and the service providers. I do think, though, that what airlines are mindful of, and we'll be talking to airline colleagues about, as Karen said, airport colleagues about, is we are seeing sometimes double-digit increases in the relative number of those seeking assistance, which is a good thing. But we need to be, there is a lead time to making sure that there is a staff in place, particularly for next summer. And then the next stage on from that is, even if you have the people in place, they need a little bit of time to train and get up to the standards of where perhaps you would be after a few years' experience. And then it's making sure that those people are deployed where they need to be at the time aircraft are arriving, which is where we come kind of full circle to pre-notification and other things we can do to make sure that the resource is being deployed. It's just not, having it's great, but it also needs to be used properly.
Could I, sorry, with permission, just on the pre-notification point, just to give you a sense of the feeling, very good airlines will, you can see sort of 80% pre-notification. Some of the experience for Heathrow, for example, last year it was as low as 60%. And what that means is that there were at least sort of on average about 1,500 passengers per day requiring assistance that hadn't pre-notified. So it's quite large numbers of passengers and sort of unpredicted services that they need to provide. So clearly, the better we can get with pre-notification, the better able we are to.
Anything that's been done, through both airlines and airports to try and encourage passengers who do need that assistance to book that or.
I mean, clearly, it's about providing passengers with the information and asking not just airlines. Sometimes that's travel agents. It's people book to fly in lots of different ways. So there's a challenge for us as a sector to make sure that we get that information and ask passengers and make them aware of the sort of information that we would like from them. And the more that we can do that. But of course, some of that assistance, as Rob said, is inbound. So, there may be people travelling from other countries where they, haven't been asked those questions. So, we will have to deal with that, and we, strive as airports to provide that service to not those that haven't pre-notified as well. But it does have a knock-on impact.
Thank you, Chair.
Just before I turn to Gavin, Sarah, you wanted a quick supplementary?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's slightly off topic, but Anna, you rightly said that we want to have everybody travelling by air. Now, one of my concerns is people with allergies actually have concerns that there's no overarching framework for airlines when it comes to serving food in flight, and airlines are left to decide their own individual policies on this. So this can rightly lead to confusion, and I've experienced that with one of my own constituents. In terms of being able to access air travel, what assessment, if any, has the industry made of the benefits of an overarching regulatory framework for airlines for passengers with allergies? Has there been any assessment of that? Because right now it is that individual airlines can just decide what they want to do for people with allergies. Very off topic.
It is. I mean, it is off topic, and it's not an area that I'm an expert on. And I would expect it to be something that would be considered by our cabin safety team. So it's perhaps better if we respond to you after today, if that's okay, in writing about anything around that, because I wouldn't want to tell you the wrong information.
I think on it, I'm very happy to take it away and look in more detail. I would say ultimately what airlines want is consistency and clarity when it comes to any guidance. So whatever the policy is, if there is to be one, just make sure that it's clear and they can enforce it. And bringing it a bit back to a related, in the world of sort of more specific accessibility, we have an example, for example, where accessibility assistance animals is an area where the airlines are reporting quite considerable increasing challenges where there used to be a pretty clear definition of what constitutes an assistance animal. There isn't now. So it's being sort of left to airlines to make decisions about what constitutes an animal that should be safely on board an aircraft, which doesn't really benefit anyone. And I know CAA and colleagues, it's something that's being worked on, but it's an area where ultimately what airlines want is a policy they can communicate clearly to their customers, be that around allergies, assistance animals. So.
Thank you.
Gavin, I'll turn to you next.
Thanks so much, Chair. In preparing for this panel, I was having a look at the airport access reports, and I was quite pleased to see that Glasgow is consistently one of the better, or perhaps the most consistent performer of airports above a certain passenger level, which is heartening for the MP for Glasgow Airport. But that notwithstanding, Anna, you've taken us through the CAA's responsibilities and what have you. I just want to probe a little further now in how you actually carry them out. So could you perhaps tell us how you actually ensure that the accessibility regulations, such as they are for both airports and airlines, are currently followed?
So how we
how proactively do you work to ensure that they meet their obligations?
So obviously we engage with airports and airlines on a regular basis. We also have a team of individuals that are responsible for these areas, and we go out to airports on a really regular basis and observe the service that's being provided. Across September and October, which are peak months for provision of accessibility services, I think we spent about 36 days in my team monitoring 10 different airports, so that we can see for ourselves how well the airports are performing, but also enable us to check that the data that they're providing with us is a true reflection of what we're seeing on the ground. So what we're doing there is we're looking at the timeliness of the provision of that service, and we also get survey responses from consumers who have received the service themselves. We also, so as part of the framework, airports are required to have in place working groups which disability organisations join to impart their lived experience and to make suggestions of how things can improve. And we attend those working groups so that we get to hear both sides of the story, and we can then use the information that we glean from that to encourage further improvements.
And the CAA over the last, since Brexit, has taken on a slew of new responsibilities and has obviously increased in size. Has there been any issue with regard to capacity in terms of any of your proactive work in health and safety and ensuring that airports and airlines are meeting their obligations? So
we have a distinct team that looks at accessibility and passenger rights in general, and that team has actually grown slightly in that period of time, and we've got plans for it to grow a little bit more. We think we need to do a bit more work in this area, but it hasn't been negatively impacted by that.
Okay, thanks. Karen, you and other passenger groups have indicated that the reduced mobility reporting mechanism, or the airline should be obligated to carry this out as well. Could you perhaps go a little further as to why you think that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, we do support that. That's something that the CAA has been consulting on, and it goes back to my point earlier that passengers don't care who is responsible, and actually our view is that it ought to. We can see the behaviours that are being driven by the framework that we have for airports, which is positive, and it does drive the sort of focus on that, and we would like to see that extended through all of the passenger journey throughout the flight. So we think that makes sense, and we would support that.
That notwithstanding, and I'll come on to Rob, do you think there could be any improvements to that mechanism as it stands at the moment?
I mean, I think as airports we feel what the framework that we have is working well, so I don't necessarily see any further changes to that part. As I say, we would like it in as similar as possible framework for the airlines, and it should be matched. We think the more that you make this information available to the public, the better, because that drives improved behaviours.
Rob, do you think that the airlines should be under the same obligations?
So in terms of the airline accessibility framework, we've responded to that. I think the principle of the framework we're happy to work with. There were some aspects that we had comments on. So I think the initial proposals for an airline, the equivalent framework would cover something like 20 airlines, and there are over 100 airlines that come into the UK, and we would say that the performance of the UK carriers that we represent is pretty good in this space. So you might be missing a trick if you have a framework that doesn't actually look at quite a few other airlines, and getting into aspects where some things are outside of an airline's control, be it upfront aircraft they are designed by the manufacturers, and sometimes that gives limitations. So we didn't want something where airlines might be unduly penalised sort of disproportionately for things that they may not have control of, which could be as the way that an aircraft cargo door opens, for example. But the principle of it is something that we were very happy to work with. We understand why it's being done. We understand the role it's played with airports, and something we're going to continue to talk to CAA as it's developed.
Do you think there's airlines, not all clearly, but airlines are sufficiently knowledgeable or are seized of the importance of this issue? We had Michael O'Leary in front of us a few weeks ago, and he said that airports, I'm paraphrasing, but he said essentially airports were terrible at getting wheelchairs to aircraft, when it's actually the airline, it'll be in his case Ryanair, but it's the airline's responsibility through their ground handling contract to get the wheelchair to the aircraft. Do you think that's an issue, that it's not the same, the culture's not the same in an airline as opposed to an airport in that respect?
I've seen in all the conversations we've had with obviously we represent the UK carriers, it's taken hugely seriously. No airline wants to be seen as failing its disabled passengers and customers. It's absolutely talking to our members, there is often dedicated teams. There's increasing amounts of focus. I know that, for example, I think EasyJet fairly recently has relaunched its, I'll get it right, Assisted Travel Advisory Group, and Lord Blunkett is chairing that. So there's a huge amount of willingness and good work. So we've seen in the last few months, IATA, which represents international airlines, has published a really good piece of new guidance on how to move mobility equipment safely, and it gets into the weeds of this is how different wheelchairs work, this is the common issues with how they're transported, bits which might break off, bits which might be vulnerable, and how these should be safely stowed aboard different aircraft. So there's a lot more work to do, because that is somewhere where there are, and there can still be incidents, for example, but I don't see any lack of desire to improve from airlines.
Okay, you're not allowed often didn't ask you if Michael was wrong when he gave evidence to the committee. But if I could move back to yourself, Anna, as regards to the CAA enforcement powers. It's strange when we talk about the CAA, we generally always talk about whether they need more powers, whether it's for customers or what have you. But clearly we've had Transport for All, many people who've given evidence. In fact, I'll quote Transport for All, the CAA are very limited in its ability to hold all airlines to an equitable consumer standard. Do you think that's fair? Do you think you need more powers? And if so, what powers do you think you need?
So I think we've been quite public about the fact that we would like more powers. So our powers currently stem from the Enterprise Act, And we would particularly like more powers around information gathering powers, so powers that would enable us to get much more information directly from the airports and the airlines, particularly when things go wrong, so we have visibility of where there's challenges and where we can look for trends there. And then also we would like to have civil powers which would potentially allow us to do things like impose fines when things have gone wrong, and we deem that's necessary. I think we'd always want to continue to have the positive engagement with industry that we currently have, but I think having those additional powers would be really helpful. I know the government announced in June that they were supportive of us getting those additional powers, and we really welcomed that announcement. It requires primary legislation change, and they have said that they would look to provide us with those powers when parliamentary time allows.
At the moment, you're essentially just relying on reputational behaviour, the impact on reputation from airlines, and are some better than others in that respect?
I think the reputational impact is quite powerful. We do also have undertakings that we can put in place, and we have put in place in the past, which effectively require an airport or an airline to change their behaviours and do something. It's quite a time-consuming thing to put in place when we do that, and in the event that that doesn't work, then the next step would be to go to court, which is again also very time-consuming. So we find the reputational side of things very effective, and we've seen that within our airports framework. So if I give you an example, when we produced our first report in 2015-16, there were 10 airports which were considered very good, and there were 12 that were needs improvement or poor. In our most recent report, by the end of the year, and granted it was a very challenging year in 2022, by the end of the year, 25 airports were very good, and 16 of those airports managed to achieve very good for the whole year. And there was just one that was needs improvement. I think that demonstrates the impact that reputational regulation can have of making improvements over time.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Would you welcome to see having more power, civil powers, indeed the power to fine airlines?
So our view on this is our priority in this space for accessibility is cooperation. We've got a good relationship with the CAA. We're talking to the regulator around the airline framework. There's a workshop coming up with DFT on these issues in a couple of weeks, where we can deep dive into some of the problems. On powers themselves, I think we would want to see what those are. We don't think the CAA has a suite of powers in this space, the reputational, but also the ability to get commitments from carriers to improve in certain places as well as other parts. So look, we think there are powers there. I think that it's important that if any additional powers are there for a reason to address something that's currently not working. I think we want to see a little bit more about what that could be and how those would be used. But again, it's a conversation we're absolutely willing to have. Okay, and Karen, lastly from Reacher, overwhelming support from passenger groups for the CAA to have robust powers in this area. Would the OA welcome that?
I think, like Rob, we would be open-minded. If the CAA feels that there is something within the regulatory framework that doesn't work currently, then we would, consider that. But I do go back to from what we have seen is that reputation is for our industry, for airports, is absolutely key and really drives that behaviour. I think one of the challenges always with having multiple players is whatever those powers, if you're looking at fines, then becomes quite complicated about, well, who do you fine and who was actually responsible, when actually as a system what we want is for it to work. So we would consider powers if that's necessary. We'll have a look at that. But actually, I think the having the framework that requires that sort of publishing reputation is much more immediately sort of driving behaviours.
Or the level of fines, a £50,000 fine to Heathrow is somewhat different to a £50,000 fine to Newquay or something like that as well. But anyway, Chair.
Thank you, Gavin. I'd like to conclude this session by returning to the issue of how personal mobility equipment is handled. If a wheelchair or other bit of equipment is damaged or lost, do airlines treat that as a luggage issue or an accessibility failure?
I would say our airlines treat it as an accessibility failure. There's absolute recognition that wheelchairs and mobility equipment are not luggage. They are people's independence. They are, people's ability to carry on with their lives and the holiday, their travel. When it comes to the vast majority of cases of where mobility equipment is moved it's done appropriately and safely, and there are no issues. Issues do happen, and we do see still too many incidents where there may be damage to a wheelchair. There is the Montreal Convention that applies that in theory caps the amount of compensation or damage that airlines would be obliged to pay to repair or fix a wheelchair. More often than not, where incidents happen, the value is less than that cap, and I know the government is consulting on lifting that cap for domestic flights. But in practice, airlines will look at this on a case-by-case basis. They will see what's happened, and they will often go beyond the Montreal Convention, those sorts of caps. So I think it's absolutely not the case that there is, in the event something does go wrong on those rare occasions, there's a very sorry, that's the limit. In our experience with our airlines, that is not how it's treated when incidents do occur. They will look in, and they will often go further if that's the fair thing to do.
And are incidences of loss or damage recorded separately to other luggage issues?
I believe so, but I would need to confirm. I'm happy to come back to the committee with that.
It would be helpful if you could supply that information and what the trends are. Is it getting better or worse compared to recent years? And is there an issue with out-of-court settlements for damaged equipment obscuring the focus on this as an issue?
I think I'd struggle to answer that. I know that from speaking to our from our airlines, if something happens, it is prioritised internally. It's not something that's dealt with necessarily by the person on the front line, and it will be escalated. It will be dealt with. The circumstances of any kind of damage or incident will be investigated, and a solution will be found. And I think because no airline wants to fail their customers in that way, whether or not I can't really comment on whether and how this might get escalated to the courts. I haven't heard from our members that being an issue in this space. It's very much on how do we collectively reduce the incidence of it happening through better training, work with manufacturers to get the mobility equipment better able to travel safely, those sorts of things.
There's also a live debate about the extent to which wheelchairs and other bits of mobility equipment can be taken onto the cabin with the passenger. And I appreciate it's a broad simplification because types of wheelchairs differ, sizes of aircraft differ, so there won't be a one-size-fits-all solution. But is there, from each of your perspectives, is there work going on to look at aircraft design and safety procedures and all the related points to allow more passengers to take on with them into the cabin their wheelchair or other equipment?
So the short answer is yes. As you say, it is highly complex because there's lots of different types of wheelchairs, lots of different types of mobility equipment. There are safety issues if there are, for example, batteries involved, certain sizes. But there is absolutely a desire, and often this also means speaking to manufacturers as well. So it can be a long lead sort of situation. But if and where we can enable people to go onto the aircraft within their chair and stay safely on their chair throughout the journey, that's definitely an aspirational place you want to be. I don't think it's not a widespread practice at the moment. The individual will tend to have to be transferred, but it is a live issue, absolutely.
Is this something the CAA is looking at?
So we're very much aware that there's technology being developed which could potentially allow individuals to stay in their wheelchair and the kind of the standard seat to be adapted so that the wheelchair can kind of slot into that position, and I believe that's being looked at by the FAA in terms of the safety legislation around that. It's a really exciting time, actually. There is the potential for this making a really big difference for people who are wheelchair users. I suspect that it won't fit on the configuration of every aircraft that it exists currently because they do need a little bit more space, but it's certainly a brilliant step in the right direction to enable that improvement in accessibility for wheelchair users.
And is this something that would require an international agreement?
think so. I'm not an expert on all the safety legislation associated with that, but I think it's about the Civil Aviation Authority in the region that the aircraft is registered. But and certainly the CAA have had conversations with the individuals that are involved in developing that technology, and we would very much be willing and happy to work with them to try to enable that to become a reality for people.
It'd be helpful if you could perhaps write to us afterwards with more information about the timescales for this work and when we might be able to see some definitive proposals.
We'll be really happy to do that.
Lovely, thank you. Again, I fear the clock is against us, and we still have our third panel to hear from. But for now, can I thank you all again for your time and evidence this morning? Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I invite our third panel to come forward, please? Welcome to our third panel this morning. Again, could I ask each of you to introduce yourselves and your organisation, please? Again, starting on my left, please.
Good morning, Keith McNally, Operations Director at CPT, that's the Confederation of Passenger Transport, the trade association for the bus and coach sector.
Thank you.
I'm Loveday Ryder, I'm the Chief Executive of the DVSA, that's the Driver Vehicle Standards Agency, and we look after drivers, vehicles and enforcement activity on the roads.
Thank you.
So good morning, I'm Linda Taylor, I'm the leader of Cornwall Council, but I'm here representing the LGA. I'm the Vice Chair of the Local Infrastructure and Net Zero Board. Thank you.
Thank you very much and welcome to you all. Linda, if I could start with you. We've heard in the course of our inquiry many complaints about street clutter, poor maintenance of pavements, e-scooters, all combining to make the public realm harder for people with disabilities to navigate. Can you tell me a little about how local authorities apply the public sector equality duty when it comes to the streetscape?
I think for a lot of local authorities it's a challenge because I'm going to use local experience in most places like Cornwall. You've got A-frames, you've got chairs, you've got furniture, and if local authorities haven't trained up the appropriate person who's able to go out and issue tickets, and that's a costly process, they have nowhere else to go. So the easiest answer that we see that could happen is a default position on the legislation that London has in relation to enforcement of street pavement activity, and it seems really sensible to have that default position.
Just tell us a little bit more about how that works in London and why it's not applicable elsewhere.
My understanding of what happens in London is that if there's pavement parking in particular, you can be issued with a fixed penalty, and the local authorities outside of London could have that ability, but they have to train up specific officers to deal with it. Whereas if it was a default position, it would so make accessibility so easy to implement across, the whole of the UK.
And you think that would be welcome generally across local authorities?
It would be cost effective, and it would actually it would allow local authorities to make sure that pavements are kept clear, because it's not for just disability. It could be for people on where we've got joined up cycle routes. It could be to protect the cycle routes in Cornwall. We're very passionate in delivering our active travel, but we need some very clear legislation, and it's there for you. Default position, please.
Thank you. And just to follow up that point, you said that you referenced active travel. There's lots of money being spent on redesigning streetscapes. How well are the needs of people with disabilities taken into account when these are being designed. Now, I'll give you an example of where there's a very obvious failure just over Westminster Bridge outside County Hall. There's one of these floating bus islands where you've got the pavement, you've got a cycle lane, then you've got the bus stop on a sort of elevated bit of pavement. Now, it's safe in this terms of cyclists not being in the same path as buses and other traffic, but with people with a visual impairment, they come off the bus and then they've got a very dangerous crossing point with bikes going at often high speeds. This has been flagged to us as a particular problem, and clearly the needs of visually impaired people weren't taken into account when that was being designed. I use that as one example, but generally, how well does a process work of involving disabled people
being
in
a
the
bit
design
parochial,
process?
going back to what we do in Cornwall, and I know other local authorities follow our lead. We implement a decision wheel that is Donut Economics from Kate Rainsworth. So it's a decision wheel that we demonstrate for every decision that we make that has an impact on our residents. And obviously disability is a characteristic that is built into that decision wheel. So we look at all aspects so we can see that the decisions we're making are right and proper and don't disadvantage other sectors within our community. And that's our guidance.
Is that specifically for Cornwall, or is that a standard practice across local
We
authorities?
introduced it, and I know a lot of local authorities have adopted the model, and it's not actually just for travel, it's every decision we make. We look to see, with our protected characteristics and also with our community, that the decisions we're making are right for everybody, and it's an incredibly useful tool that we use.
And
Happy
typically,
to send it to you.
I'd be very interested
Thank
to
you.
see that. Who would you consult? What types of groups would you consult when making these sort of design decisions?
So most road schemes have to go out to consultation, especially for active travel, and we have extensive consultations, and that happens with the majority of local authorities. So, but it is beholden upon the local authority to make sure they do engage and identify if there's somebody not responding. In Cornwall, we absolutely actively make sure that we are engaging with every person who could be impacted, and we'll go out and talk.
Thank you.
Okay.
Jack, if we could turn to you next.
Thank you, Chair. And I think the first question I was going to ask is particularly for Keith, and it's about particularly some of the transport that's used for home-to-school transport, but also rail replacement bus transport and things like that, that a lot of that is currently exempt from the public service vehicle accessibility regulations. So when do you expect that we will see those sorts of vehicles actually coming into compliance and reaching compliance with some of this legislation?
Well, as an industry, we're very much committed to improving accessibility, and I think we've demonstrated that over the years. I think where the regulations were well understood, the delivery of compliance has been really good. I think where the problem arose is where you say on certain home-to-school services and rail replacement services where the regulations maybe weren't as well understood, and we developed a problem where there wasn't a sufficiently compliant fleet to deliver all those services in a compliant way, hence the need for those medium-term exemptions that are currently in place.
And how medium term is medium term? Because it's been going on for quite a while, hasn't it?
So they run through to 2026. In the meantime,
do you expect that we will be entirely compliant by 2026?
I don't, if I'm honest. We have put forward a proposal as part of the DFT's call for evidence on PSVAR, which are the regulations around public service vehicle, bus and coach accessibility. And that proposal is that all what we describe as open door services, so services that anyone can get onto, whether it's a local bus service, long distance express coach, or indeed a rail replacement service, that those services should be compliant in the future. Most of them already are. And the other element of the proposal is that where services are closed door and the passengers are known about in advance, so that's largely home school services, that those services would be compliant on the basis of demand. So where there was an accessibility requirement, that would be provided for.
Do you think that we're sufficiently meeting those needs, though? Because, you know, every year we have, and I'm sure other colleagues have similar issues, where we're getting children who don't have their transport in place soon enough, and there doesn't seem to be a sufficient supply of these sort of vehicles with the accessibility requirements for children who have got a disability. So is this a more widespread issue, the lack of vehicles that are suitably adapted to facilitate home-to-school transport?
So we're playing catch-up in effect, because coaches don't have to be accessible by law. Coaches, when they're used on services that are in scope of the regulations, need to be compliant. And as I say, it was not understood that certain services that were in scope were indeed, and that's to do with some of the complexity around the regulations and the way they were written, and indeed the way that the home-to-school market has changed over the years since the regulations were originally written. So it depends at the moment on whether a separate fare is paid as to whether the service is in scope of the regulations or not. And our proposal is that that aspect will be swept away, so that if a service was what we describe as regular, so it's got a timetable like a home-to-school service, or indeed some other sort of works services that operate on a daily basis, that they would be compliant on the basis of demand, whether or not a separate fare was paid. So you take away that complexity.
I can understand that. I mean, the question I'm asking though is, are we sufficiently meeting demand? And that's seems to be a wider issue. But the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and maybe Loveday might be able to give some stats as well, is what is the scale of this issue? How many vehicles do we have that are out there that are non-compliant with this legislation?
So if I could maybe just say that we believe there are in the region of 10 to 15,000 vehicles that are used on home-to-school services. Many of those, most of them, would be covered by the medium-term exemptions. The default position then in 2026 is that many of those would come into scope, and I believe we probably have between 3,000 and 4,000 coaches that are PSVAR compliant at the moment. There's more coming on stream all the time with new vehicles and existing vehicles that are adapted. But as I say, we're playing catch up, and in the context that the COVID pandemic hit the coach industry very hard and made it more difficult to invest.
Is your data at DVSA showing that we are seeing an improving picture, or is it...
We don't hold data on that per se. The department collate the numbers of the medium-term exemptions that there are. But my understanding with that is that there is a requirement in that each year the percentage of compliance will go up, or it won't be granted for the next year. So I think I agree with Keith, that we should see an improving picture between now and 26, certainly.
So you aren't responsible for actually ensuring that those vehicles are compliant with some of these public sector equality duty and the accessibility requirements? That isn't...
So what we will do is we will work with operators to make sure that they are in compliance where they have buses on services that are in scope. So that means that we'll work with them right from the beginning, from a new operator seminar where we will make sure that they're educated and that the drivers are trained. We work through content in the theory test, and basically every one of the things, the touch points that DVSA has with a PSV, we will check either to make sure that there's a medium
You're
term.
not collecting any data on any of this?
We have data on the number of checks that we do and then the number of offences. What I can't tell you is in total, in terms of the percentage of the fleet, how compliant it is. So, for example, we did 5,100 roadside checks on PSVs in 22-23. Out of that number, we found 14 accessibility offences. And that 5,100 is round about 6% of the fleet. But actually, when you take out under recognition, where again, that is for the our best and most compliant operators, it's equivalent to about, and we don't pull those over at roadside, we pull over about 8% of the non-earned recognition fleet each
year. What are the consequences then for those operators and vehicle owners? Is the fining regime that you are implementing, or what's the consequence?
So what we will do is we will take intelligence from the roadside, we will take intelligence from complaints that we receive in from the public, and what we do is put that through a triage process. We certainly log them all, and then we work our way through those. And what we're looking for, I think our approach to enforcement and our strategy is always that the best approach is to begin with education. By and large, operators want to be compliant, so we will start with educating, providing additional information, helping them to comply and making sure that they know what they're supposed to be doing. If it becomes a theme, or if there's evidence that they may be perhaps willfully not doing it, we will use our investigative powers. We will go do targeted checks on operators, maybe go and visit operator premises, and again look for evidence that their systems are right and that it isn't a systemic or a sort of a willful failure by an operator. If we think at that point that there is an issue here, then what we will do is refer that to the Traffic Commissioner, and the Traffic Commissioner is the regulator, and then they will make a decision based on basically the merit and proportionality of that particular case as to whether to take it forward under their powers.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mick,
thanks, Chair. Good morning, panel. My question is to Linda. And how do local authorities procure accessible home to school transport if the vehicle used by local providers are exempt from the accessibility legislation?
So the exemption actually is a little bit of a lifeline until 26 for local authorities to be able to operate. But a lot of local authorities do struggle to get appropriate vehicles and the requirements for accessibility. And I think, the bigger picture, if I may, is that we've got the Education Act of 2019, which is absolutely directional in how local authorities deal and deliver transport for SEND children. But one thing that's becoming very, very clear is that requirement is growing every year. And if you're looking at local authorities now, if you're looking at the pressures for most local authorities, school transport is a real big issue. And in 2019, the deficit was £111 million, and it's growing seriously every year. And one of the things I would ask that some considerations given to is, apart from the requirements under SEND, local authorities are working to a very antiquated school transport legislation from 1944, and that seriously needs to be looked at to help provide a better system per se for school transport. So when local authorities are not able to get vehicles that meet the accessibility needs, that is what's actually adding to the additional costs to make sure under the Education Act that they get send children to school. And it's a picture that is escalating every day.
So, are local authorities that are unable to provide accessible vehicles in breach of the public sector equality duty?
Well, they have that fallback position of the exempt, which will run until 26. But it is an absolute challenge, and they have to provide transport, and so that's where they're going out to, taxis, which is quite a gold-plated service, and that is what is actually adding to the additional costs. And then, for local authorities, once they have been able to procure a service that meets the accessibility, then they've got that challenge then of making sure they enforce what I call the street furniture, those drop-down pavements, making sure it's very clear. So there's a lot of work to be done there as well.
Next question is to Loveday. Cracking name, that, by the way, isn't it? Could you explain the DVSA's function and approach in terms of enforcing the public services vehicle accessibility regulations?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I answered previously, building on that, I mean, what we've aimed to do with PSVAR is to build it into all of the processes that we run and all of the interactions that we have with operators of PSVs. So starting from a new operator seminar, working through if they join our Road to End recognition scheme, making sure that we check KPIs monthly and the 2-year audit's got PSVAR as part of it. Obviously, there's the annual inspection of a vehicle, so the MOT equivalent for PSVs. PSVAR is built into that as well, and it is checked if the equipment is on the vehicle. When we do roadside checks, as I said before, again, we will look at the equipment, we will check that it's working. Of course, there are some constraints in doing roadside checks in that we don't go with a full coach. We need to, or bus needs to be a place where the passengers can safely alight before we do the check. But we tend to use places like coach parks, stadia, motorway service areas. And when we do a check like that, we will actually not only check the vehicle itself, we will also check the operation of equipment and actually make sure the drivers know how and what their duty is in a roadside check. If we get any intelligence that there's a problem, we will follow up, as I said, with operator premises visits, again, where we will talk to any drivers that we can find. So for us, it's about satisfying that the vehicles that are in scope are compliant and the equipment works, but also that any drivers are trained appropriately and that the operator themselves has the right processes and systems. So it's kind of an end-to-end thing for us.
How many public service operators have you enforced against in the past year for non-compliance with the regulations?
So we have, if you take annual tests, there were 69,000 vehicles that were tested. That includes ones that would be perhaps coaches on scheduled services, so that includes out-of-scope vehicles. But of those, 33 failed with PSVAR items in 22-23. 13 then passed after rectification, so it's quite small numbers that we see. On the roadside checks, again in 22-23, we found out of the 5,100 we pulled over, we found 14 accessibility offences, and so far this year we've had 3. So they're relatively small numbers that we see.
And, what concerns you have as a regulator about accessibility in the sector?
The traffic commissioners are the regulator in this space, but in terms of our enforcement, I think if I think about areas where we would like to see improvement, one of the things that we're going to be looking at is how passengers can make complaints, because I think we hear a lot of reports from customers that they find it difficult to navigate the system. There's Bus Users UK, there's a separate set up in London. We tend to respond to the complaints that are about the vehicle and the way that the equipment is working on the vehicle. And I think we're going to try to set up streamline our complaints process, signpost it a bit easier, and set up something that gives people feedback of where that their complaint is logged. I think that's an area we can do. The other thing that we've done in the past is awareness sessions. So we had in 2021, we had a special Accessibility Awareness Week. I think we'd look to do more things like that. Using more intelligence-led work as well, using ANPR to try to investigate a bit better. I think that they're all sensible things. The other thing we've done is we're going to invest in some wheelchairs. So actually on our roadside checks, we'll be able to go with a wheelchair and actually get the driver to demonstrate that they know how to restrain it adequately, get it on and off properly. So there's lots of things that we can do, I think.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. A number of local authorities are now introducing what are known as DRT service, demand responsive transit, that sit between a bus service and a taxi, where there's an app you can summon a vehicle to come and collect you and others. To what extent are those services covered by existing accessibility regulations? Or is there a gap that needs to be addressed?
So within Cornwall, the delivery of a bus service is incredibly challenging. So within Cornwall, we absolutely have to work to a timetable. But for other local authorities, if they are using exempt vehicles to address the suggestion that you've just made, which is a very good suggestion, they've got a bit of a dilemma, because if those exempt vehicles have capacity, they have to make a decision. Are they going to sell the spare seats to family members? And if they were to do that, to think more about the impact on the climate, they would then lose, or the vehicle would lose that PSVAR exemption. So it sounds good. It's a model that needs to be followed, but it is not as easy to implement, especially in a lot of the local areas where transport is not as available and freely subsidised in other parts of urban areas. It's a challenge.
Thank you. Keith, Loveday, do you have any views on the DRT provision?
PSVAR, those regulations apply to vehicles with a seating capacity of over 22, I think, isn't it? So 22 or less are exempt, and I guess many DRT services are going to have fewer than that number of seats, so they are exempt, and I think many of the services that are provided are probably accessible even though they're out of scope, so provision is made for wheelchair users and others with accessibility needs, but I don't have any data on proportions of which would be accessible and which not.
Thank you.
I haven't got anything to add either.
Okay, thank you. The last issue I wish to cover in this session is the enforcement of regulations with regard to taxis carrying people with disabilities, and particularly with people with assistance dogs. The law is very clear that the passenger has the right to take their dog or other animal with them. But we hear many cases where that's not happening. What is the problem in enforcing that law? Linda.
So for me, and I'm sorry to keep, because you go back on where you can give evidence. Within Cornwall, believe it or not, it's not such a big issue. We've had very few cases where the local authority have had to go out and enforce. But I think one of the issues I would like to raise is where you're having taxis that have been licensed outside of your particular area. That is a real big problem for local authorities to absolutely deliver that enforcement. So, one of the considerations could be that local authorities license the vehicles, and if they're licensed within that local authority, they've got much, well, they can enforce, and they can make sure that the requirements under the law are absolutely delivered. Thank you.
So if a taxi is operating in another local authority area,
yes,
who has responsibility for enforcement? Is it the local authority where the taxi is licensed?
It's the local where it's licensed.
Right, okay.
And, so it causes problems. It can cause problems, especially if there's a local area that local taxis that are coming in know there's a lot of business, like coastal resorts.
It's a big issue in Brighton, isn't it?
Yeah. So, if the local authority had the ability to license, they would absolutely be able to enforce. And at the moment, that is a little bit of a concern for many local authorities. Thank you.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on that, talk me through. So say, to give your example, say someone in Liskeard is wanting to get in a taxi that's licensed by Plymouth,
Yeah.
different authority, and they make a complaint to Cornwall Council, what rights do you have as a council to take that up with Plymouth to get them to enforce?
We don't have any legal enforcement. However, because of the close proximity of our two areas, our transport department would absolutely make sure that the licensing of that vehicle, which is, for example, Plymouth, are made aware of the issues. But as the local authority for Cornwall, we can't enforce the complaints.
And should it be mandatory for all authorities to take proactive steps to identify non-compliance, for example, doing mystery shopping or other such measures?
I would suggest that where data is showing that you've got an issue, then it would be absolutely appropriate. And it's a really good suggestion to do mystery shopping. But I think, the burden on a local authority that doesn't have those complaints, and your local authority will know if there's an issue. They do, because, they understand their community. Then I would say that there shouldn't be the burden to do mystery shopping. But obviously, if complaints escalate, then it's a really good idea to take a mystery shopper exercise.
Finally, should it be mandatory for all local authorities to maintain a list of all their accessible taxis under the Equality Act?
Absolutely, absolutely. People's health in some parts are not improving, and it's really, really important that they know what taxis are accessible, just to make their life easier as they're moving around. And also it's that assurance as well that if the local authority are listing accessible taxis, that's because they know about them, and that's incredibly important as well for standards.
Thank you very much. Do any colleagues have any last questions?
Just got a really quick one for Councillor Taylor. It's very kind of you to offer to share with the committee the model that you've got in Cornwall. I think we'll be interested in that. But just to go back to the earlier point about floating bus stops, A-frames and street clutter, and you mentioned the position in London. Things are getting worse with the advent of scooters, e-scooters, electric bikes littering the pavements. A little while ago, I think a number of us did at the invitation of the Royal National Institute for the Blind and Guide Dogs, an exercise where you wear a blindfold, going onto a talking bus as well, and then walking through a shopping centre or a neighbourhood centre, just so that you can have that lived experience of what it's like for someone who's blind or partially sighted. I thought that was incredibly valuable. I mean, I had bruises on my shins from falling over the A-frames and the chairs and things that were placed outside without any consideration for what it means for obstructions for people with disabilities. I just wonder if any of the panellists had done that.
No.
It's valuable, honestly. It's a good insight.
Yeah.
Yes, no pun intended.
Yeah. Thank you. But I think it emphasises the point, if I may, about delegated powers coming from London to the rest of the UK to deal with that pavement furniture. Thank you.
Point well made.
Thank you.
Thank you all again for your time and evidence this morning. We've had a packed morning, lots of information to digest, but thank you again for coming forward.
Thank you.
Order.